Now, a Kenyan parliamentary committee has warned President William Ruto to pump his brakes over an ambitious tax plan, given the state of the economy and the high targets. It's not just a parliamentary committee that is warning against this tax plan, it's also the World Bank, which says that the Finance Bill 2023 will affect purchasing power of Kenyan households, and of course, they will take a serious hit if the bill passes. In a new report, the Washington-based institution said that the ongoing tax reforms, which include raising value-added tax on fuel from 8 to the standard 16%, will dampen growth in the near term and likely add to the current inflationary pressures owing to an increase in prices of basic commodities, especially food and fuel. The proposed taxes come at a time when businesses are dealing with reduced demand on account of the high cost of goods. The Finance Bill 2023, laid before Parliament in May 2023, makes the most far-reaching changes in Kenya's tax legislation in recent times. Now joining me is Aly Khan-Satchu, Africa geo and macroeconomist and the CEO of Rich Management. Aly Khan, it's good to see you again. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's good to see you again.
So the latest news breaking this morning in regards to this is that there seems to have been some concession from the president and his party. MPs have reviewed downward the controversial 3% levy on housing to 1.5%, but they kept the doubling of VAT on petroleum products. They're also proposing changes to the clause on 15% digital levy on content creators, bringing that down to 5%, and then also plan to increase rental income tax from 7.5% to 10%. But other things are still on the table. I think we need to start with looking at how very ambitious this plan is for where Kenya is aiming to go and where Kenya really is right now when it comes to taxation. So Aly Khan, let's start from there. Has Kenya been unsuccessful when it comes to tax legislation? Is it about enforcement, compliance? What's the issue?
So, the incoming administration, frankly, were presented with a perfect storm of sharply increased interest payments, which were due on loans that had been taken, and really were facing a cash crunch. That crunch expressed itself in a number of different areas. Salaries were delayed and so forth. And a lot of the government's various arms were not being funded in a timely fashion. So clearly we'd hit a crunch moment. And partly this budget is a reaction to that situation that they found themselves in. And they've pretty much raised taxes across the board. You touched on the housing levy. You've had an increase in the NHIF, VAT on fuel going up, being doubled, capital gains tax being increased. It was pretty much a swathe of tax increases. Now, the challenge for the government, in my opinion, is that, it's a bit like squeezing a lemon. You can squeeze the lemon so far. And I think essentially we're very close to that point when the pips are squeaking, and I'm not sure the government is going to collect as much as it expects. For example, there was an increase in capital.
Aly Khan. And we'll make sure we're getting back in touch with Aly Khan. But let's get some of the taxes that are being proposed back on the screen so we can take you through those as we look to get Aly Khan back on. So for Kenyans right now, they should be expecting a 15% excise duty on bank money transfer charges, which is coming down from 20%. There's also a 15% excise duty on airtime and data, down from 20%. Reduced prices for medicines due to incentives and refund of overpaid taxes in 6 months, down from 2 years. There's a 16% VAT on fuel. This also comes after the Ruto administration removed the subsidy on maize flour as well as fuel. So coming up from 8%, that's going to head to 16%. A 3% housing levy, now that we can tell you this morning, is going down to 1.5%. A 15% withholding tax for digital content creators. And again, it's now been suggested that that should move down to rather 5% rather than 15%. And a 15% excise duty on mobile money transfer charges, which is going up from about 12%. Aly Khan, are you back with me now? Okay, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, fantastic. So you were talking about the ambitious targets, and just quickly before you go back to that, let me explain what those targets look like, because it's interesting when you put this into numbers. So the Kenyan Treasury, depending on who you're talking to, some have said it's about 2.57 trillion that the Treasury is targeting around, or 3.6. So let's just give a minus, let's say about 3 trillion Kenyan shillings that's being targeted in taxes for the 2023 to 2024 fiscal year. And they look to make anywhere over 100 billion Kenyan shillings extra from what they perceive to be contained in the Finance Bill 2023. So when you look at the ambitious nature of this, given the current economic situation of Kenya, what do you really make of it? You say he may not really be able to meet it.
No, I don't see. I think there's a very low probability of the government being able to meet. They've set some very ambitious targets. I think they're going to have to borrow more money, and that brings up a different challenge entirely. I think this is way too aggressive in terms of attempted calculation, tax collection. I think it's a political strategy, right? Go early in the political cycle to try and increase it as much as you can. But I think it's way too ambitious. The economy has been under significant pressure, and I think they've moved the needle way too high in terms of what they're going to collect. So unfortunately, that means pressure is going to come to bear on borrowing, and that has its own challenges.
So interesting you touch on it, but I feel like you just sort of passed it by, that this will just send Kenya back to borrowing, because there are concerns about this eventually widening the budget deficit and leading Kenya right back to where Ruto is trying to avoid. How much of a probability, before we move on, do you think that really is?
Yes, I think, clearly borrowing is going to have to do some more heavy lifting. There's been a very interesting pivot here in Kenya back to the West. Kenya is seeing, has aligned itself much better with the G7 than many other African countries, South Africa in particular. And obviously the multilateral institutions have been coming through. We recently got $1 billion off the World Bank. So I continue to expect more support from multilateral institutions and from the West. They're going to have to do more of the heavy lifting. But I think the message Ruto had to send to everybody was, look, I'm trying my best. And if it doesn't work as I expected, then you're going to have to help me out. And I think that's essentially what's going to happen here.
So interesting you bring up the multilateral organizations. We're seeing two strikingly different responses. Now, the World Bank is warning about how the proposals can bring household pressures, inflationary pressures as well. But the IMF seemed to have been very happy and actually gave Kenya, I believe it's an additional 162.5 billion Kenyan shillings under the 38-month program that's been agreed. A difference in strategy, a difference in thinking from the Bretton Woods institutions. What do you make of that?
Yeah, that's very interesting, and it's smart of you to pick up on that. I think, look, this is an IMF program. The IMF has been heavily embedded in the Kenyan financial sector, in the government administration, and I think this is very much an IMF-light program. I think the World Bank are, however, addressing the downside risks of this. We've had significant deterioration in terms of people's take-home income because of inflation, and clearly the average Kenyan citizen is going to be under significant pressure. So it's a balance, but make no mistake, the IMF pretty much you could say wrote this program.
And we know how many African economies and people feel about the IMF. So, Aly Khan, let's look at some of the specifics now. As I mentioned earlier, we're seeing that 3% controversial levy on housing is now at 1.5%. But I think what more Kenyans are really reacting to right now is the fact that the doubling of VAT on petroleum products after the same president removed the subsidy on not just maize, but also on fuel as well. How is this landing in Kenya? What does it mean for Kenyan households?
So this is the big issue, more than everything else, is the doubling of VAT on fuel. VAT previously was 8%. It's going to go to 16%, as you've mentioned, and that's going to ripple right through the economy. It is our largest expense item on the balance sheet on a month-to-month basis. This G2G oil deal was meant to relieve pressure on the Kenya shilling just because of the sheer quantum we were spending on fuel. So I think if I was to identify the biggest challenge, it's going to be the effect on inflation, which I expect to go higher, the cost of doing business, and I think you now enter a second round of inflationary pressure on the economy and a further squeeze on people's income. So if I was to identify the single item, it would be that. But of course, the government is expecting, it's easy to collect. You fill your car, the government collects its VAT. So it's from a government perspective, you're not chasing down people, you're just being remitted it every week. So it's helpful in that respect. But, it's going to be very costly for the economy to bear.
And unfortunately, we have to add that there's also going to be a 3% tax on turnover or gross sales tax, which is coming up from 1%. And that's another impact that small businesses in Kenya are really going to feel. We've talked about the fuel impact as well. All of this coming with high rising living costs, high transportation, subsidies gone as well. When you look at this, because I know there have been some protests in regards to the tax proposals, and that comes after the protests that were led by Ruto's competitor in the presidential elections last year. What's likely to happen when you talk about the demand side? And you mentioned, of course, the World Bank focusing on the downside risk. What are we looking at when it comes to how Kenyans can even put more money back into the economy?
Well, that's going to be absolutely the challenge. I think the demand side has already been weak. It's not muscular, and I think it's going to weaken further. And therefore, in terms of consumption taxes like VAT, I think predictions that it's going to go up in a straight line are not going to be correct. So yes, I think this is a double whammy. You've got a weak economy, and then you're increasing the tax on that same economy. I think we're going to see significant pressure. I was surprised at some of these GDP prognostications of around 5%. I think it's going to be considerably slower, because I think we're now reaching a point when the economy is really going to start to buckle under the pressure.
So let's talk about an interesting part. We know across the continent now, more governments are taking notice of the digital economy. And the Finance Bill 2023 is proposing some taxation there. So there's an introduction of a withholding tax on digital content creators at the rates of 15%, but MPs are saying they should be brought down to 5%. There's also those selling cryptocurrencies and non-fungible tokens will be expected to pay a digital asset tax at the rate of 3%. Now, a Kenyan content creator and comedian, Alex Mathenge, is quoted as saying, "You can't milk a cow which you're not giving grass." And he's talking about the fact that it seems policymakers are not helping young Kenyans, but young Kenyans are now in this digital economy, and you want to go and tax them. Should we be seeing taxes on digital content creation or even cryptocurrencies right now as it is?
Yeah, that's, the digital economy was one of the most dynamic sectors of Kenya's economy. And Kenya historically was a low-cost destination, whether it was for entrepreneurs, and it created a tremendous and very vibrant environment around that digital space. And I think, unfortunately, we've now moved the needle in the wrong direction. We're going way too high. You're better off taxing something 5% and growing it 10 times than you're taxing something 15% and actually seeing it reverse from growth into negative growth. So I think here again, this is a mistake that we've been way too aggressive. I doubt that they're going to collect that much money. And really, Kenya wanted to embed its East African positioning. And I think what we're making ourselves is a less attractive destination. I was on a phone call with some European investors, and for the first time since I've been back in Kenya, and this is more than a decade, I've heard them really talking about going and setting up shop in other places, not necessarily in Nairobi. That to me is a signal in the noise, and a poor signal, and makes me quite concerned. So I think this is negative. I also think the crypto space, Kenyans embraced crypto. It all started with the M-Pesa story, which was kind of a crypto currency of its own, way before crypto really turned up. So Kenyans embraced it. And I think here again, we're just looking at everything and just saying, oh, let's stick a tax on it without thinking of the long-term effects. With respect to the digital economy, this is what we are famous for. And we should be very, very careful about how we tax it.
Okay, so let's look at this. The president made campaign promises. I think that's part of where some of the anger is coming from. Kenyans probably expected that with the Ruto administration coming in, life would get better. But he also met a very difficult situation at hand. High inflation, shortfalls in revenue collection, massive public debt at about $74.1 billion. He's had a tough time meeting any of these promises. What options are available to the Ruto administration beyond taxation? And even some of the concessions we've heard this morning, what more concessions do you think we should expect?
You've made a very good point. I mean, really, it's difficult. It was a very difficult situation that he inherited. We had a massive splurge of spending. I remember there was an argument about how Kenya could have a higher debt to GDP during the previous administration, and the example of Japan was used to make that comparison. And that was an economically illiterate comparison, and that should have rung alarm bells everywhere. So he inherited a very difficult situation, and also the nature of politics is you've got to make promises when you're trying to get elected. So on top of that, expectations were lifted, and he's essentially having to deal with that expectation management now that he's in power, and the situation he inherited. And politically speaking, I think he's trying to deal with it in the first 2.5 years as fast as he can. Otherwise, he's going to be caught out. So I think it's a deliberate political strategy. What options are left? Surprisingly, they're not talking about asset sell-offs. There are a lot of assets that could be sold off. They're not talking about rejuvenating the capital markets. That's something else they could be looking at. But, policy maneuver space is very limited. That's got to be borne in mind. They're going to have to lean harder on these multilateral institutions and leverage the political stance they've taken in support of the G7 and the Ukraine scenario, for which I think they can probably milk more cash out of the multilateral institutions.
All right, Aly Khan, before I let you go, as it is across much of the continent, is the same situation we find with taxes in Kenya. So there's a large element of distrust, and I think it runs through many of us. But when you look at it, there's issues around corruption, which has been described in Kenya as being endemic and pervasive and dominating the provision of public services. The country ranks 123rd out of 180 countries on Transparency International's latest corruption index. So are we seeing this resistance to the changes in the tax legislation and the proposals as being largely determined because of the negative impact it'll have on Kenyan people, or also being sort of caught up in a lack of trust in the public sector that's meant to actualize this, whether it's to enforce compliance, enforce a collection of the money, and then also enforce the right and correct usage of taxpayer funds?
That's a very interesting question. So I think, there is a degree of skepticism, and I don't think it's a skepticism about the administration. I think there's a degree of skepticism about Kenyan government managing our taxes effectively, not overspending, and that kind of thing. So you're pushing against that level of resistance. And I think that's one of the complexities that the government is being faced with. As you said, corruption is a massive issue. But, like most of Africa and globally, in fact, if you look at even developed markets, the commitment to dealing with corruption is very light at the moment. But overall, look, I think this administration has its heart in the right place, is trying to do what needs to be done. But it's an uphill task, and it's going to require a lot of support in my opinion, from multilateral institutions, bilateral support as well. Because if he doesn't collect these taxes, the shortfall is going to grow larger. And at the moment, Kenyan African economies are shut out of being able to borrow in the Eurobond markets. Local bond markets are under stress. So you can see, it's a perfect storm that they're facing, not just in Kenya, pretty much across the continent.
as well, obviously. So we've seen some concession this morning, that parliamentary committee warning just as the World Bank. What do you think we should expect from Kenyan MPs? A lot of Kenyans will be expecting very thorough interrogation of the bill as it is, but it doesn't necessarily mean they must pass it as the president has sent it to them. So what should we expect as we understand that conversations and discussions are on?
I think on balance that they will have considered this concession of a halving of the housing levy to have been a significant victory by civil society and the MPs will also take that as something supportive for the current situation. I'm not convinced they're going to manage to get many more concessions. And then bear in mind that the government has a majority in Parliament and is going to whip those MPs big time, like the President mentioned a few days ago. So I think that is the major concession that's coming. We're going to have to face these increased taxes. And I think then a few months down the road, the government's going to have to tweak these as they see what kind of cash flow it's generating. I'm not as convinced as they and their spreadsheets are that they're going to collect as much as they can, and then I think they're going to have to react to the situation.
All right, Aly Khan-Satchu, Africa geo and macroeconomist, as well as CEO of Rich Management. Thank you so much for joining me. It'll be something we're following very closely as the conversations are on in Kenya's parliament. Thank you.
Thank you.
And there are fears that these new taxes could actually lead to Ruto's administration having to send a supplementary budget to the parliament, and we could see a widening of the budget deficit. But let's quickly run through some of the taxes that Kenyans need to be getting ready to possibly withstand, or of course have to take into consideration when it comes to how things are playing out right now. So there are so many taxes coming in, and they include taxes on bank money transfer charges. It's down from 20% to now 15%. 15% excise duty on airtime and data. We're hearing from Kenyan telcos on this as well. Reduced prices for medicine, which is a good thing due to incentives. Now, there should be a refund of overpaid taxes in a space of 6 months rather than 2 years. That 16% VAT on fuel, that's going up from 8%, and also comes after the Ruto administration removed the subsidy on fuel as well as maize. The 3% housing levy has been slashed to 1.5%. As Aly Khan said, that looks like a win for many. There's a 15% withholding tax for digital content creators. The proposal is that it goes down to 5%, and a 15% excise duty on mobile money transfer charges, which goes up from 12%. The Ruto administration is facing shortfalls, it's facing high debts, rising cost of living, and it's proposing massive taxes on the Kenyan populace. How will this play out, especially as it has now hit Parliament? We'll be following very closely to see what else happens. More concessions, or will this scale through because the president has a majority in the parliament? You're watching Business Edge. We'll take a quick time out. We also have international business for you, and then looking at the impact of the U.S. debt ceiling deal, as well as Saudi Arabia's decision to cut 1 million barrels per day. What could it mean for African economies? After this.